intuitively why that would be the case. That as the Federal Reserve creates more money out of thin air on its balance sheet and then loans that into the U.S. economy, that effectively creates what's called liquidity. But all of that money, it basically has to go somewhere. It doesn't just sit on in checking or in bank accounts. It gets lent out. It gets lent out to businesses. Those businesses, they pay their employees with it, and then that money goes into your savings account and goes into brokerage accounts. Banks, they get that kind of money. They invest in the stock market. They invest in companies. All of that basically creates what accelerates our economy. All of that liquidity, it helps accelerate the economy. That's when we get the term stimulus. When we get these checks, these COVID checks, that money doesn't come, it does come from nothing, but that stimulus to the economy, that's where that comes from. It comes out of thin air from them printing the money and then it ultimately getting into the real economy, and then we spend it, and then that stimulates and helps spur the organic growth that we need. So back to the point here. The reason why I will not take the vaccine is because I had created this model and I had just started looking at it and watching how the stock market was trading relative to it. And I happened to notice that I really don't know when I created this model. I don't know what year it was. I have to go back and look at my spreadsheet dates. But it wasn't very long that I had been looking particularly at this model. But I happened to notice probably late 2019, but definitely by early 2020 that this is early 2020 right here. This is all through 20. That bottom right there, that's July of 2020. So this plummeting line here, that's 2020, and then that peak around here that you're seeing. I don't know if you can see my mouse pointer because I'm not zoomed in enough. So this peak right here is 2019. You can look at the dates here. So of September 1st of 2019, this is where this chart was. What this chart here is showing, I've called it the Z-score, and then in parentheses I put the Fed model risk question mark. I put that there is because this model, a Z-score, it ultimately is kind of measuring risk. It's kind of a gauge for risk. So what this chart here is showing, it's a graph of a number that is kind of oscillating between -3 and +3. And in the center, which is not really the center, but we'll say this, it's the center. The 0 is the center, and you could consider 0 to be an average reading. An example of what this chart is representing is think of the weather. When I was talking to my mom trying to explain this to her, an example would be, think of the temperature in the month of July, in somewhere in Ohio, or just like a temperate climate, where the climate's change. It's not always hot and it's not always cold, but the seasons fluctuate. In the middle of July, you would expect maybe to see temperatures around 70, 80, maybe 90 degrees. That would be considered normal for the summer months, especially in July and August. So imagine those types of readings to be like a 0 reading. On this type of chart, you would expect 80 degree weather in July that would throw you, a reading somewhere around 0. As the temperature, rises, maybe around here as we get to a 1, maybe it was like a 110-degree day. Maybe that's a little too much, but maybe it was like 95 degrees. So maybe that got, pretty hot for the month of July or August. Even for a month of July and August, that turned out to be a relatively hot month. So you would maybe expect to see this type of model, this type of risk model, to deviate away from 0. And when I'm talking about weather, it's not really considered a risk model, but a z-score. The z-score is measuring the distance away from the average. So a -3 would be a pretty substantial distance away from 0, from, the negative side, and then a +3 would be a substantial distance from 0 on the positive side. So if we see a +3, you could consider that, maybe like seeing an 80-degree day, in December. Intuitively you would think that's a pretty hot day for the month of December in a temperate climate. It's generally cold out, there's snow on the ground, but if you're all of a sudden burning up hot, ready to go to the pool in December, I would imagine that on a graph, a z-score graph, would appear something like that, well above 0. However that graph would look, it would be some kind of number far from 0, because that is not average, that's not normal, that's unusual. So that's what I need you to intuitively understand as you're looking at this type of chart, this z-score Fed model risk here. You can probably see where I'm going here. Going back from 2003, if we look at this Fed model, and what this Fed model is measuring, it's measuring basically the distance between the S&P 500 and the Federal Reserve balance sheet in terms of, a standard deviation, meaning as we oscillate or gravitate towards that 0 line, you could basically say the S&P 500 and the Fed total assets, they're kind of keeping lockstep with each other. Either the stock market isn't moving very much, or the Fed assets isn't moving very much. But generally, as we move around the 0 line, things are normal looking, pretty much about average, according to this set of data that I had back-tested the model on. And so you can see here, as we approach the 2008 crisis, before it really even happened, but as we approached the financial crisis of 08 and 09, this is right here, this is showing March of 2007, so the crash hadn't even happened yet. But you can see, as we approach that bandwidth of 1, according to the Fed model, the Fed, this, what I'm going to call just the Fed model, or the Fed risk model, this z-score, we had moved 1 standard deviation away from the average, meaning the S&P 500 had maybe gone up a little bit too much, or the Fed balance sheet had shrunk. The Fed balance sheet really, it doesn't shrink very much. They do decrease it. They can take money out of this. They can decrease their balance sheet, but you can see the graph generally is trending from left to right positively. So what ended up happening was to explain, I guess, what would counteract the distance we had deviated away from the average. What usually happens is what's called mean reversion, or the stock market, corrects itself. It reverts back from its either overbought or oversold condition, where if there's suddenly a mass panic out of the market, usually there's a quick, at least retest of the highs to, you know, balance things out. That's just the way the market works. Same with to the upside. Usually, if there's a sharp move upwards, there's a corrective move downwards, because the market is generally governed by volatility, statistics, and math. You know, people capitalize on those types of events. So the market generally will not stretch too far on its own without some kind of counteractive move against that, just to correct whatever impulse move occurred, just to keep things organized in a sense. And we're not talking. That's not considering that, again, the stock market is likely governed. Not governed's not the right word, but the Federal Reserve balance sheet is likely a very significant constraint on the growth of the stock market. So, for us to move one standard deviation away from the average, it is pretty significant. And I'm not saying that crash that we had in 2007 was caused by that, because this is just one set of data. I'd have to go back further and look at how the stock market performed in the past to really make that type of assessment. It's worth noting that. It's worth noting that we were one standard deviation already away from the average. What would be considered average? Oops, wrong graph here. Here, I apologize. I'm showing the wrong graph there. Here is 2007, just before the crash that occurred in '08. So as we approached that one standard deviation move away from zero, risk was growing in the economy. Risk was growing according to this Fed model. I wouldn't say that it's substantial risk, but it's just noting, being one standard deviation away from the average, it's noteworthy. It's just, that's comparable to just one of those unusually hot days or unusually cold days, in the middle of the season. It's not like drastic, but it's definitely noticeable. You notice something like that. And that's what occurred here, is we got one standard deviation away from what would be considered average based on the correlation between the U.S. stock market and the Federal Reserve balance sheet. And then all of a sudden, we've got this housing crisis that has occurred that just turned into nuclear fallout in terms of finance. All of the shit that was sold on Wall Street, and it had spread out through all of the economy and the global financial system, and the plummet there. That's what you see. That's the result of that. We definitely mean reverted. We didn't just mean revert. A great buying opportunity was created there. The market dropped to a significant point, highly significant point, because we were then at the bottom of the lowest point on in terms of this Fed risk model was around. It was between '08 and '09. You can see that we bottomed on this in terms of the risk model between '08 and '09. So this is showing, in terms of the relationship between the Federal Reserve balance sheet and the stock market, we became almost 2 standard deviations away from what would be considered average, somewhere between the year of '08 and '09. Okay. So what this is kind of showing, it was definitely a pretty significant buying opportunity because it was highly unusual. Like it's just in terms of this set of data that I've backtested on, we could say that If you bought right here, you were buying when the U.S. stock market had fallen to a point that was significantly